I've invested over $1 million, and this year I just turned 33 years old. And I'm definitely not saying that to brag. I'm saying it because if you want to build true wealth for your future without all of the fear and confusion that usually keeps most people stuck on the sidelines, then you're definitely going to want to hear what I'm going to have to say in this video, because it can completely change the trajectory of your financial life. And for context, I run a 7-figure financial coaching business called JFF, or Journey to Financial Freedom, and I've helped nearly 1,000 people go from financial chaos to financial peace while building sustainable wealth. And I've seen what works, definitely what doesn't, and most importantly, what keeps people paralyzed when it comes to investing in the first place. So in this video, I'm going to break down exactly what I learned, the mistakes I made, the breakthroughs I had, and the principles that guided me along the way. And so if you're sitting on the sidelines with investing because you're confused, scared, or you just don't know where to start, then watch this until the end, because I'm going to show you why investing isn't as complicated or risky as you think. And so for a little context here, how I've diversified or actually allocated that $1 million, I put about $300,000 in the stock market, about $400,000 into businesses, several of them being my own, like meaning investing in starting businesses or ones that were already up and running. And then also real estate, about $300,000 in real estate. I think honestly, the total investments on each one of those is a little bit more, but we'll just be conservative and round it down to about $1 million. And that's how I've invested it. And so that's honestly one thing that I have learned, right? Is that the stock market isn't the only thing you can invest in. And I'm going to come back to that point, right? Because that is one of the biggest things I've learned in my investing career now. Right. But I'm going to start with some lessons on the stock market first, because it's probably why most of you people clicked on this. It is still very important. And I think once it's taught to you by the right person with the right intentions in mind, with the right teachings, it's actually a lot easier than you think. And you're actually able to go take advantage of it in a fashion where you feel empowered and hopefully profitable. I just taught a lesson to my community inside the Good Steward program called How to Best Invest in the Stock Market. And so if I'm just thinking through my journey, right? When I initially started, right, my mindset was, okay, this is the responsible thing to do. I know I need to do this. I'm hearing the other professionals I work with at Johns Hopkins at the time, it's where I was working, doing this. And so I knew generally that it was good for the long term. And, most, I think, important to me at the time was like, this is how I'm going to retire one day. And I've definitely seen money over the long haul. Right? I'm not saying it's going to be guaranteed money, right? But there's a high probability that if you're investing the right way over long periods of time, you'll make a good amount of money, right? The idea is when you're investing in the stock market, which I'll break down the basics here in a second, it's like you're just buying businesses at a really good price today and just hoping in 30 years when you go to cash out, they're worth a lot more, right, than what you bought them for. Right? Or whether it's business, whatever your investments are, you're buying them at a certain price right now and then hoping when you go to or retire one day that like what you bought it for is way less than what you could sell it for now. Kind of like just think about a house. If I bought a home 30 years ago, I think it was worth probably went for $80,000, if that, right? Reselling it now for, $800,000 made a pretty decent profit. It's kind of the same thing with your investments, right? You buy them now and in retirement, you're hoping that you can sell them for more than what you bought them for and live off of the money that you sold them for, right? And so let's understand the basics though a little bit here, right? Stocks and bonds. Stocks are it's just buying ownership in companies that is issued to you in what's called a share. So if I bought Apple stock today, I'm now a very small, depending on how much money I invested, small owner of Apple, the company Apple, and that ownership is given to me in the form of shares. Bonds are just loans to entities. So stocks is ownership in companies. Bonds are loans to companies. And so we're organizations or entities, right? And so the higher the risk, the more money you can make with that bond. So for example, there's things called treasury bonds, which are basically just loans to the federal government. Like the federal government is going to give you your money back. So very low risk to lose the money, but that's why you can only make, again, give or take a few percentages here, about 5% on that money. Right? It's not bad, it's stable little amount, but like you could other places make more than 5%, 10, 15, 20, 25 and upwards, right? The idea though is that the riskier the business gets that you're giving this bond or this loan to, the more money that you make or the more interest that you're making. So if you got like a really risky startup company, you can make 50% off that bond, right? But you could also you've got a high probability of not even getting any of your money back, right? So the higher the risk, the higher the return for bonds. I hope that makes sense. And so the other thing that you hear a lot about is just index funds. The most popular one is called the S&P 500. Index funds are just a whole bunch. You buy one fund and it purchases you a small little sliver of ownership in a whole bunch of other companies. right? So the S&P 500, you can buy the S&P 500. What that is you're buying ownership in the top 500 companies in the United States, right? So the best 500 companies in the United States, you go buy shares in the S&P 500, you're buying a little bit of a sliver of each, depending on how much money you put in. The more money you put in, the more buying, right? So your sliver might get a little bit bigger and bigger with the amount of money that you put in, right? You're buying a little sliver in all 500 of those companies. And the idea is that like you're betting on the 500 best companies in America to win over long hauls, which is, I think a pretty good bet, right? Like think about the amazing companies, right? Like Apple, like Amazon, just to name a few, right? Meta, there's so many big, amazing companies out there, right? They're always going to get the best interns from Ivy League or top-notch colleges. They're always going to get the best recruits out of those colleges. They're going to develop those recruits very well into quality managers and directors, if not recruit externally. And then they're always going to have the best CEOs, those companies, right? Because it's just the benefits of working for them, even outside of the pay. The pay is great, but even outside of that pay, there's a lot of benefits to work for those companies, especially in those CEO roles. So if you think of it like that, right? Like over the long period of time, like those companies are going to do good, especially if they continue just to solve amazing problems for people. And so just something to think about. And one of my favorite pieces of advice from Warren Buffett is just, he talks about not investing in something if you don't understand it, or like if you can't explain the company and what they do, like probably shouldn't invest your money into it, right? Because a lot of times when you're investing your money into something, you're betting on that business and or industry to do well, right? And so if you can't even explain it, how are you supposed to understand if it's going to do well or not, right? So you also want to, what really helped me, I read a book by Tony Robbins, but it talked about just a lot of the expectations in the stock market with the objective of eliminating fear. So the majority of the mistakes made in the stock market are around fear, whether there's two types of ways fear shows up. It's either make you make bad investments, or it could make you sit on the sidelines, which you're going to see here. That's a lot costlier than maybe bad investments, right? But point being is, when things start to become expectations, they're no longer problems. And so when you can expect something, right, you don't have to be afraid of it anymore, right? And so I'll give you an example here. Over the past, I believe, 75 to 100 years of the stock market, for what we've been tracking data on, I believe we've got data to go back 120 years. I could be wrong about that. But at least I know 75 years, if not longer, where we've just got data to see what happens in the stock market year after year, decade after decade, etc. And so if you study that data, it is guaranteed that every 3 to 5 years, the market will face what's called a bear market, which means that it drops by 20% or more. That's a pretty big drop, right? And so that's guaranteed, right? So when the stock market does drop, like goes into a bear market, and it's been 3 to 5 years, I was talking to my clients about this a year or so ago. I was like, yeah, it's the expectation. Like, we haven't had a bear market in the past 4 years. We're hitting one now. And the data shows us that over the past 75 years, if not longer, of the stock market, every 3 to 5 years, we can expect the bear market, right? So you don't freak out as much. Instead, maybe see it as an opportunity. But let me finish this thought, and I'll come back to it being an opportunity, right? But the data also shows that every single time, right, that we hit a bear market over the past 3 to 5 years, it is followed by a bull market, which means the market rises by 20% or more, aka 100% recovery rate. And so over the past 75 years, if not 100 years, right, in the stock market, every 3 to 5 years, a bear market or a 20% drop has happened. But every single time there's been a 100% recovery, or every single time a bull market has followed. And so it's the idea that after every winter comes spring. And so the winter being the bear market, where the market drops, the spring being when it recovers and or the bull market. And so going back to the idea of like this being an opportunity, like if you think about it, right, when the market drops, some of the best companies in the world are on like clearance sale. One really drastic example was when COVID hit, right, and the stock market dropped a ton. There was nothing wrong with these companies, right, like Apple, like Amazon, like Meta, right, just to continue to name some pretty commonly known top companies in the United States. There's nothing inherently wrong with those companies, but people were freaking out and they were selling all of their stock, which to then collect their cash to then hold on to in case of the world ending or the market completely going out. But what happens when that happens is supply is high and demand is low, right? So there's two reasons why the stock market drops. Number one, that like those companies are just doing bad. Like if Nike had a big scandal and or like their products aren't good anymore, right? Like their stock could drop, right? Because the value of the company and the shareholders' eyes isn't as valuable anymore, right? Because they're not doing as well, right? There's a big issue, right? Or what happens is there's nothing really wrong with the companies. There's just something going on in society that is making people freak out, like COVID, right? So when people sell their stocks, what they're doing is they're trying to sell their stocks, get rid of the stocks, offload it so they can have cash on hand in case anything crazy happens, like people were unsure what was going to happen in the world when COVID hit, right? And so they were selling their stock off. The issue, like I said before, it's supply and demand. It's like when somebody's selling something at a rapid rate, the demand is low. That's mean nobody wants it, right? So when nobody wants stocks, that's displayed through people selling at a rapid rate, like when COVID hit. And so if demand is low and supply is high because everybody's selling, right? And now there's a whole bunch, instead of it being like an exclusive stock where there's only a few, that exclusivity makes it cost more, right? Makes the value higher, but supply is high because everyone's selling it off. So it's available at a high rate and people are literally getting rid of it. So the demand's low. That causes values of anything in the world of economics to drop, right? It's just the concept of supply and demand. But with stocks, that's how it works. And nobody wants this, and there's a ton. It's not exclusive, right? It's not desirable. Stock market prices drop. That's what happened with COVID. And so my wife and I, we invested a decent bit of money during COVID because we knew all of this stuff. Thankfully, I just got done for a couple of years studying a bunch of books, Tony Robbins one being one of them. And I was like, no, babe, like we don't panic like everybody else. We put more money in the stock market. In a couple of years, we're going to make a lot of money off of that because we're buying a lot of really good businesses on clearance sale that I truthfully don't think are going to go out of business. They're going to bounce back in a year or two once the world recovers from COVID. And thankfully, that's what happened, you know? And so the last thing is understanding fear versus strategy. There's you only lose money in the stock market when you pull money out, right? So the market can drop, right? You can look at your app and like, oh gosh, I'm down 20%. You technically, for the time being, lost a little bit of money, but the only time you truthfully lose money or lock yourself into that loss is when you pull money out. So if I got $30,000 invested into the stock market, right, and it's down to 20,000 for the time being, like, yeah, I'm down 33% there. I'm down $10,000. That's scary. But if I just let it leave it, right, it should bounce back. But if I pull the money out because I panic, right, out of fear, like, oh my God, I'm going to take it out before I lose more, you lock yourself into that $10,000 loss, right? Because the money has to stay in the market to be able to recover. And if you pull it out, you lock yourself into that loss. So I ask myself, when it comes to the stock market, I ask myself, is this strategy or is this fear, right? And so we have so many awesome client success stories with this, but just helping one of our clients, Aaron, like really wrap her head around like the long-term idea of investing, which is like just kind of set it and forget it. Invested in the stock market over 3 years with working with us. She's been able to invest over $100,000 in the stock market, which is pretty awesome. And so by the way, if you want help implementing the financial principles I'm sharing in this video, from investing to budgeting to debt payoff, click the first link in the description right now of this video for a free consultation with my team. We'll walk you through exactly how the Good Steward program works and see if it's a right fit for you. And so inside of the program, we teach a lot of this stuff. And one of the things that I really like to talk about, right, when it comes to investing as well, is another quote from Warren Buffett, where he says, don't look to buy decent companies at a great price. Look to buy great companies at a decent price. And so, for example, I gave a description earlier about like kind of what a great company is. A great company is one that has history of winning, right? History of good leadership, history of good morals and ethics, right? Large fan or consumer base, right? Strong branding, right? And then also you can forecast into the future that they still want to be in business. They want to grow. They're going to continue to expand. They've got a great mission on their heart, right? A lot of people want to work for them. So it goes back to the example earlier. They're always get the best interns, graduates, managers, and executives, right? Those are companies that I would want to bet on, AKA put my money into, right? Not like, oh, this decent company's on like 80% clearance. Like, let me take a risk and buy. Not to say there's not a time and a place for a little bit more riskier approaches, but overall, from a general standpoint, that's why you want to look to buy great companies at a fair price. And in those bear markets, in those dips, it's like a funny phrase in the investment world, is like buy the dip, because it's true. When the market is dipped, these great companies are on sale for a decent price. The opportunity to capitalize. I love to automate everything too. My investments come out on the first, no matter what. I tithe, and the second automation that comes out on the first is my investing. And years ago, when I met my wife, when she was my girlfriend at the time, I helped her to start investing. I helped her to set up investments for a pretty challenging number. It stretched her, right, on the first of the month. And a couple of years goes by, we end up getting engaged, and then a year or so later getting married. And she had been investing on the first of the month a pretty decent size amount. It really challenged her, right? I looked at her budget and she was spending that money on other things that she didn't need, So it's like, we can afford to invest it then. If you can afford to be a consumer, you can afford to be an investor or an owner, right? And so we got married, we combined our investment accounts, and I looked at hers and I was like, whoa, babe. You have that much money in your investment account? That's awesome. She's like, yeah, just years ago when we met, you had me set it up on the first. I just learned to live without it, and it just literally just added up over time. And it was just a beautiful result to see happen. That was only like 3 to 5 years, maybe. I imagine decades what can happen if that's your approach. And so just remove the emotion from it, remove the thinking, remove the enemy's opportunity to put a mustard seed of doubt or fear in your mind. Just set it on the first, automate it, invest it, pay yourself first. Right, after you pay God. All right. So diversification, this is something I'm going to come back to. Like, this is a very common piece of investment advice, which is like, don't put all your eggs in one basket, which is fine. If your approach is to work until you're 55 to 65 years old and then retire off of your retirement account, your 401k, your Roth, etc., those types of things, then yeah, this is diversification is safe. It hedges against risk and it allows you to build progressive long-term wealth. It becomes a tiny bit problematic when you have different goals, like maybe faster retirement goals, but we'll talk about that here in a little bit, right? But before that, I just want to talk about compounding interest, right? Compounding interest is amazing. It's how you make money in the stock market. One of the main ways. It's if I invest $10,000 this year and over the next year, it makes 10%, that is $1,000. I made $1,000 off my 10,000, right? That's 10% of $10,000. That interest, that $1,000 that I made is now put back into the account. So now I have 11,000 invested instead of 10,000. Now I'm making 10% off of 11,000 instead of 10% off of 10,000, which is more, right? So that's now I'm making 1,100 over the next 10% of 11,000 is 1,100 over the next year. Now that's getting added in. Now I've got 12,100 that I'm making 10% off. And so the idea is interest just keeps getting added into the account, and however much you're making, I'm using 10% as an example. 10% of a larger amount of money is more than 10% of $10,000, right? And so I ran some numbers before I hopped on here to have a good example. Just looking down at my notes, I ran this example that if an individual starts investing at 25, right, they're putting in $500 each month and making an average of 10% each year over the next 40 years, which would take them till 65, the average retirement age, right? So start at 25. Keep that in mind. That's the most important thing here, right? So they start at 25 in retirement. They'll have $2.8 million. $2.8 million. All right. Then there's option B, someone that was fearful, confused about investing, and they waited until they were 35 to start investing. So 10 years later. Nothing different about them, investing the same amount, making the same exact amount of money, both looking to take the money out when they're 65. The only difference is option B or person B waited 10 years. When they get to retirement, they'll have a little over $1 million. So a 10-year difference, someone getting started at 25 compared to 35, it's almost $2 million more. It's $2.8 million compared to $1 million, almost 3 times as much, or almost it actually is. It's $1.8 million extra in retirement. That's crazy. And the idea there, that's compounding interest. The faster you can start compounding interest, the better. Basically meaning the faster you can start investing, the better. And the big thing too here is when it comes to investing, particularly I think in the stock market, I think real estate and businesses, which we'll get here to in a second, but think long term, right? Proverbs says a smart man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, right? And we've got an client of ours right now who she has a son who is 19 years old and he's already has $20,000 invested in himself. So it's not only one thing to leave them money, but also leave them the financial literacy as well. And so that's kind of my breakdown, right, of the stock market. Probably what a lot of you clicked on this video for, maybe we'll call maybe most important here, right? And I hope that provides some clarity here. But I want to talk about some other things too when it comes to investing. I've made a lot of mistakes. One that I'll talk about here though is that I actually, when I moved into this house that I'm in right now, I moved in about 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago, right? And just eager to steward it well, I think. Maybe some ego involved in there as well. But my wife and I, literally the day we got the keys and closed, we started renovating. My father-in-law is a contractor and he was in here day one, right? And he was here for a year and we just kept adding things onto the project, right? And looking back, I invested a lot of money into this house, right? Which, it's paid off. From a value standpoint, we now have $500,000, $600,000 of equity in the home just in 3 years, right? Which is nice. But at the same time, like the only time you can touch all of that equity is if you sell the house, right? Yeah, you could take out a home equity line of credit, home equity loan where you can leverage some of that equity, right? But the only time you really touch all of it is if you sell the house. And like as of right now, we don't plan to sell this house. We want to keep in our home or in our family for generations if possible. And so my mind goes to like, oh, was that the best investment? Especially because I can't really touch any of the returns, right? That equity. And so how I think about it, right? If I could go back, I should have used that money to buy rental properties, right? Then from the cash flow from the rental properties, then used to fund the renovations on this home, right? So just something to kind of think about there. And it reminds me of a quote from Robert Kiyosaki that says, you want to own assets that pay for your liabilities. He's like, it's okay to have liabilities like cars, homes that, you're not making money off of like rentals, right? But he's like, try to own assets that pay for those liabilities. And he uses the example that he drives a Porsche. He loves his Porsche. One of his assets in his business makes enough money to pay for that liability, pay for that Porsche, right? And so own assets that pay for your liabilities. And something to also think about too as well, it's like when it comes to people that are listening to this, they have a fixed income. I'm not saying, don't live your life a little, right? I'm not saying you can't treat yourself. I'm not saying like don't have nice things, but if you think about it, like driving luxury vehicles, right? Luxury vehicles cost more a lot of times sticker price wise. A lot of times you got to put 93 gas in them compared to non-luxury vehicles, which take 87. Sounds funny, but probably another 50 to 70, maybe depending on how much you drive, $100 a month right there. Luxury vehicles are more expensive to insure, right? And they're definitely more expensive to fix. Like a non-luxury vehicle oil change $50, a luxury vehicle 180, right? And so if you think about it, like with a fixed income, right, you only make so much money. Why would you spend that money on those things, right, when you can be investing into assets or into investments that will make money for you? Again, I'm not saying don't live your life. I'm not saying eat beans and rice for the rest of your life. That is not what I'm saying. But if you have a fixed income, it's one thing to think about currently, like when it comes to your current expenses, but another thing to think about too, it's like, how can you start diversifying that income through smart investments? I think this next part's going to help you a lot with that. And so I'll talk a little bit about how my approach has evolved, right? Going back to the beginning when I said the first thing that I learned, and I said I'll come back to this, was that like the stock market's not the only thing you can invest in. And then when I first started investing, I heard investing, I'm like, all I hear is the stock market. That's all it makes me think of, right? It's not a bad thing, but there's more things that you can invest in. In my opinion, there's multiple things you can invest in, but like I just kind of break it down to there's stock market, there's real estate, or there's businesses. And honestly, I'll even throw in yourself in there. I've invested a lot of money in myself and my own mentors, my health, etc. And some people would argue that's the best investment you can make, especially if we're the ones responsible for generating this income, being creative, being in a good spot to be a good steward of what we've been given and what God continues to entrust us with and multiply it for kingdom reasons, right? We got to make sure we're right. I always say your external wealth will never, exceed your internal wealth. So, I'm going to leave the self out of it here for a second, but just to kind of be a little more black and white, you've got the stock market, you've got real estate, and you've got businesses, right? And so, you have to ask yourself, how do you want your life to look? And then align your investment strategy to produce that outcome. Another way to say that is, when do you want to retire by, right? Like when do you want to be financially free by? And so financially free, obviously I think we all know at least what retirement is, but really what happens when you're retired, you're technically financially free, and being financially free kind of just simply means you have enough passive income streams or like cash flowing assets that the money that is flowing or being produced from those assets is more than your expenses. I kind of just made them sound more complicated than it needs to be, but it's like your passive income, right, strategies have enough income coming in that it's in access to your expenses, right? And that's basically what happens, and hopefully it happens in retirement. And so if you don't want to wait till you're 65 to retire, right, you might want to start thinking of another strategy, right, around how to invest your money to allow you to invest at the age that you want to invest at. Basically, the stock market is for the long haul. Particularly, most people listening to this, with the amount of money that you have left over each month after expenses to invest in the stock market, it would probably take you until you're 60, 65 years old, right, to be able to have enough money in that account to live off of between when you retire and when you pass away. That's really kind of the idea, right? It usually does take that long. And so back when, I was at a really good day job years ago, about 5.5 years ago, I left Johns Hopkins. I worked on the business side of healthcare and ran like the Johns Hopkins hospital from a business standpoint. And I had a really good job. and making really good money. And I was 26 or 27 at the time, had been investing since I was 23, right? And making good money. And I was disciplined with it. And so I called my financial advisor one day and I was like, when can I retire? And it was while I was on vacation in Hawaii, because I was like, I got to be able to live with this freedom for the rest of my life. I can't have somebody else controlling my time, money, and my energy. So I called him like fresh off the beach in Hawaii. And I was like, his name's Nate. I was like, Nate, when can I retire, man? And he ran some numbers and he was like, oh man, good news. Almost 10 years earlier than the average American, 56 years old. And while I understand where he was coming from, right? Like to me, that was horrible news though. I was 26 at the time. I was like 30 more years, right? Going to a job that I don't love, let alone barely like, living for a short 2-day vacation, right? And getting looked at sideways if I take a week vacation and being away from my family for 50 to 60 hours a week. Like, nah. That doesn't sound like it for me. And so I started to explore other options. Like, what are other things that I can invest in, right? That will allow me to be financially free a heck of a lot faster. Because that's what I wanted for my life. At the time of being 26, I was like at 35 at the latest. I want to be financially free. And there's no way that I could do that with the stock market and my current income. And so what my wife and I decided to do was to look into starting businesses. Now, you can start your own business and or you can buy somebody's current business, right? That's a big thing. Not as versed in that as I am in starting your own business. But I find too, for believers, a lot of times God wants to use our unique skill set and story through a business to provide value to his people, to spread his kingdom, right? And so I was able to start my business, I think back when I was 27, right? And about 3 years later became financially free because of it. And so that's the beautiful part about businesses is there's no cap on the amount of money you can make and there's no cap on how fast it can make you financially free. And so that's kind of how I started to shift my thinking over time. And it brought me to my last point here, which is, I said something about diversify earlier, which is a great strategy if you're going to go with the 65-year-old retirement route. If you're going to go with long-term, right? Like that's fine. To each their own, like not knocking anybody. But if you want to retire earlier, what I found was this may seem kind of risky because, diversifying is hedging against risk, right? Meaning that like, okay, I got money, some money in stocks, some money in bonds, some money in gold, some money in crypto, some money in real estate. So like, if one's down, hopefully the rest of them are up and I'm up in totality, right? Like, or if you have all of your money in one thing and that thing's done, goes out of business, down, now you're out, right? And so this may sound risky when you think of it that way, but I'll explain why it's not actually, right? But my new investment strategy for the people that want to be financially free a heck of a lot sooner than 65 years old is to go all in on one thing to get rich and then diversify to stay rich. Number one, right? Why go all in on one thing? Because what I mean by that, think about your resources, your time, your money, and your energy, right? All finite, right? And so if we're scattering them amongst many things, like putting a little bit of money over here, a little bit of time over here, a little bit of energy over here, a little bit of money over here, right? We're going to not get best outcomes because we're not like, if you're, think about it this way, better depiction here, right? Let's just say I've got 5 glasses in front of me, like kitchen glasses that you pour water into. One of the 5, right, is filled all the way up to the top. And if I take it and try to evenly disperse it through all of the cups, each cup is only going to be filled 1/5 of the way high, right? And so that's kind of what happens when you're diversifying your resources, your time, your money, and energy into multiple things. You're only getting 1/5 of the outcome if you're lucky, right? And so an easier way to say this, let's just say like, all right, I'm putting part of my money into my business, part of my money into real estate, part of my money into the stock market, right? That's good. I'm diversifying, but I'm only going at 1/3 of the speed that I could go at if I just took all of that money and put it into one thing. And that's what me and my wife did a couple of years back with our business. We put the majority of our time and money and our energy into the business, allowed that to take off. And when that took off and the profit started to get much larger than our old situation, meaning we had a lot more money coming in and left over, we then took that money and started to diversify from there, right? Or I would call our first business our financial freedom vehicle. It's what made us financially free, so we didn't have to wait till 65 and rely on the stock market. We were able to retire or be financially free sooner, right? So it's like go all in on one thing, aka your first financial freedom vehicle. Once that's stabilized and successful, now take the increased income that's coming in and start and or buy or acquire more financial freedom vehicles. So let's just say for an easy example, my wife and I, we've got multiple businesses now, right? And so if one of them's down, the other 2 can be up and we'll still be up in totality. And now that's how we're leveraging diversity after we went all in on one thing. So people say that's risky, right? Which I understand that, but my question is like, what are you risking if you don't do it? And if you're somebody that doesn't want to wait till 65 to retire and be financially free and live life on your own terms, then you're risking a lot. You're risking a lot. right? By not taking any chances to see if you can do it faster, to see if you can live your life how you actually want to live your life. And so I hope that this was helpful. And so that's exactly how I was able to invest $1 million by age 33 and learn these critical lessons along the way. But there's something I didn't tell you at the start of this video. And everything that I just told you is completely useless if you don't know how to actually get started with investing. So what I want you to do is click on this video, right? If you want to learn how to start investing step by step in 2025. And I'll see you in the next video.